The last log caught at 11:30 and burned the way dry wood burns in January, clean and fast, and without mercy. Caleb Marsh stood at the stove with his arms at his sides and watched it go. The wind hit the north wall of the cabin, and the whole structure answered with a low, tight groan. He did not move toward the wood box. He already knew what was in it. Nothing. The stove would be cold inside the hour. Ruth slept behind the curtain with Clara between them. The child curled against her mother's side the way she had slept since she was an infant. Caleb listened to the sound of their breathing and did not wake them. The temperature in the room had already begun to drop, not the kind of cold a man feels on his face, but the kind that settles into floorboards and rises through boot leather. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed quiet about something that put the people you love at risk because you believed you could fix it alone before they ever found out? Subscribe if you believe silence is not always the same thing as strength. Caleb's grandfather had come to Nebraska in the winter of 1849 with a mule, a handsaw, and one other thing. Not money, not a deed. A method learned from a Pawnee man who had kept his family warm through 3 plains winters in a structure with no chimney and no stacked wood. The old man had written it down in a diagram so plain a child could follow it, sealed it in an iron box, and set the box beneath the floorboards of whatever structure he called home. When Caleb's father built the claim cabin outside Harlan in 1871, the box came with the floor. When Caleb took the cabin after his father's passing, he left the box where it was. He had never needed to open it, not until now. He crossed the room and crouched at the northwest corner and pressed 2 fingers between the boards. The box was there. He touched the lid. Then he stood up without opening it and moved to the north wall. He ran his hand along the base stones in the dark. They knew his hand. He had fitted each one himself. Back in October, Aldous Greer had called out to him from behind the counter of the general store with 3 men watching and said a man who turned down good wood before a Nebraska winter was either a fool or already dead. The 3 men had laughed. Caleb had walked out into the cold without buying the wood and without answering. The word Greer used had followed him the 4 miles home and had not left him since. He had another way. The question was whether the other way would hold against a blizzard that had dropped the temperature 40 degrees since sundown and was not done yet. Caleb stood at the north wall with his hand on the cold stone. Then he went back to the iron box, and this time he did not stand back up. He had the box in both hands when Ruth came through the curtain. She did not call his name. She looked at the stove first the way a woman looks at a thing she already knows is wrong but needs to see with her own eyes. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked at the wood box in the corner. No words passed between them. She crossed to the wood box and looked inside it the way a person looks into something empty when they cannot accept that it is empty. Her hand went to the bottom of it. She lifted it out without a sound and set it back down. The wind outside found a gap somewhere in the eave and pushed through it with a high, thin note that ran the length of the ceiling and stopped. Ruth said, "Where is the reserve wood?" It was not a question. Caleb set the iron box on the table. He did not open it. He put both hands flat on the surface beside it and looked at the grain of the wood and said the thing he had not said since September. There was a promissory note, $14, signed in September, when the East Field failed, and the merchant in Kearney would not extend the line. He had sold the 2 reserve cords in November, sold them to a family on the Dunbar Road for $8 a cord, and used the money to pay the note before it came due. He had not told Ruth because he believed he would find another way to replace the wood before January. He had not found another way. Ruth stood at the far side of the table. She did not move toward him. She did not move away. In October, when Caleb had walked out of Greer's store with the sound of 3 men laughing behind him, he had told himself the reserve wood would carry them through any storm the plains could produce. He had told himself that on the ride home. He had told himself that in November when he loaded the cords onto the Dunbar family's wagon and watched them go. Greer's voice had been in the back of everything since, not loud, just present, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a boot. Clara coughed from behind the curtain. It was a single cough, dry and deep, and it did not come again. But Ruth turned toward it the way a mother turns without deciding to, without a pause. She went through the curtain and came back in less than a minute. She stood in the doorway between the two rooms with her arms at her sides. The cabin had dropped another degree. Caleb could feel it in his jaw. Ruth said nothing. Her silence had a shape to it now, not anger, something older and more specific than anger, the kind of quiet that comes when a person understands that the danger they are in was not an accident. Caleb pulled the iron box to the center of the table. He lifted the latch. The lid came up without resistance. There was no money inside, no deed, no letter, only a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the creases, covered in lines so precise they did not look like an old man's hand, but like the hand of a man who had drawn the same thing many times until he got it right. Caleb unfolded it and set it flat on the table between them. Ruth looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. She understood not all of it, not the mechanism, but the larger thing. This had never been a backup. This had always been the plan. The iron box had not been waiting for an emergency. It had been waiting for this specific night, this specific storm, and Caleb had known it was there the way a man knows where the load-bearing wall is in a structure he built himself. He explained it plain and short. A radiant heat trench, a shallow channel along the base of the north wall, lined with flat stones, fed by a single coal brick set at the south end of the channel. An exterior vent packed tight with snow on the outside to slow the draw and push the warmth back inward. The flat stones would hold the heat for 4 hours after the coal brick spent itself. 4 hours was enough to reach dawn. Ruth said, "How long outside?" Caleb said, 20 minutes. Maybe less if the snow is right. Then Clara coughed again, and this time it did not stop at 1. Ruth went through the curtain fast. Caleb heard the child's breathing before Ruth spoke shallow and quick, with a catch in it that had not been there at supper. Ruth came back to the doorway with Clara in her arms, the child's face pressed against her mother's shoulder, and Ruth's expression carried something that required no translation. The fever had come up during the night. Clara could not go outside. Clara could not be left. To pack the exterior vent, Caleb had to go out into a blizzard that had already killed the temperature to somewhere below 0 and was pulling loose snow off the plains in sheets that a man could not see through past arm's length. He had to be outside for 20 minutes minimum. The seal had to be tight, or the whole mechanism would fail too much draw, and the coal brick would spend in under an hour, not 4. If he went out, Ruth would be alone with a fevered child and an unlit trench she had never seen built. If he stayed, the trench stayed cold. Have you ever stood at the one door left open to you and understood that walking through it meant leaving behind the people you most needed to protect? Tell me in the comments. Every word you leave there matters, and I read each one. Caleb sat at the table with the diagram in front of him. The stove was cold now. His breath came in a thin cloud and dissolved. He looked at the north wall. He looked at the curtain. He looked at his hands on the table. He did not move for a long moment. Ruth stood in the doorway with Clara against her chest and watched him, and did not tell him what to do. Then Caleb stood. He took his coat from the hook by the door. He put it on without hurrying. He picked up his gloves. Ruth said, "Come back." Caleb said, "Yes." He opened the door, and the blizzard came in like a living thing. Not wind exactly, but pressure. A wall of it that hit him across the chest and face, and took the breath out of the doorway before he had cleared the step. He pulled the door shut behind him, and stood for a moment with his back against it, while his eyes adjusted to nothing. There was no visibility past his own hands. He moved along the cabin wall by touch, one palm flat against the boards, counting the timbers until he reached the north corner. The snow was not falling so much as moving sideways, packed hard by the wind into something closer to grit than flake. It found the gap at his collar, and the gap at his wrists, and it did not stop finding them. The exterior vent was 18 inches from the north corner at ground level. He crouched and found it with his fingers. The opening was clear. The wind had scoured it clean. He began packing snow around the frame, pressing it in tight with both palms, smoothing each layer before adding the next. The work required pressure, not speed. A loose pack would let the draw run too fast, and the coal brick would spend itself in an hour. He packed it the way his grandfather's diagram showed, 3 inches out from the frame, angled slightly upward, sealed at the top edge last. His hands stopped hurting after the first few minutes. That was the part he did not think about. Inside, Ruth laid the flat stones along the channel at the base of the north wall, following the diagram by lamplight with Clara watching from the bed. The stones were already fitted to the space, each one cut to width, each one seated in the channel Caleb had built into the cabin's foundation the autumn they first moved in, 7 years ago. Without explaining to Ruth why the north wall base needed to be 3 inches deeper than the others, she understood it now. She set the last stone and felt the channel complete beneath her hands, and did not say anything to the empty room. Caleb came back through the door at 22 minutes. He did not speak. He went directly to the trench, took the single coal brick from the box on the shelf, and set it at the south end of the channel. He lit it with one match. They both watched. The flame caught and held. Nothing happened for 4 minutes. Then the first stone nearest the brick began to change color, not visibly, but Ruth put her palm an inch above it and pulled it back. Caleb watched her face. She put her palm above the second stone, then the third. The heat was moving up the channel. By the time it reached the north end of the trench, the cabin had already shifted, not warm, not yet, but no longer falling. The temperature had found a floor. Clara stopped pulling her blanket tighter and lay still. Caleb sat at the table. He reached into his coat and took out the promissory note, the original, the one the Kearney merchant had returned to him marked, paid in November, and set it on the table between them. Ruth looked at it. She looked at the amount. She looked at his face. She went to the stove and poured the coffee that had been sitting cold in the pot since supper and set the cup in front of him. That was all. Dawn was 3 hours out. The stones were warm. Clara's shivering had stopped, though her forehead still carried the fever. The wind had not lessened, but the cabin had stopped answering it. Then the knock came. 3 strikes, hard and flat. The knock of a hand that had been outside long enough to lose its feeling. Caleb went to the door and opened it, and Aldous Greer stood on the step with 2 men behind him, their coats packed white, their faces pulled tight against the cold. Greer's eyes went past Caleb into the cabin. He saw no fire in the stove. He felt the warmth coming from the north wall. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Greer. Neither man spoke. Then Caleb stepped aside. Greer came in first, then the 2 men behind him, and Caleb closed the door against the storm. The 3 of them stood near the center of the room, with the snow melting off their coats onto the floorboards. One of the men held his hands out toward the stove before he understood the stove was cold. He pulled his hands back. Then he turned toward the north wall, where the warmth was coming from, and stood there without speaking. Greer looked at the stones along the base of the wall. He looked at the cold stove. He looked at the lamp on the table, and the folded diagram beside it, and the empty iron box with its lid still open. His face did not change, but he stood with his back to the north wall for a long time, and did not move away from it. One of the other men, the younger one, Petition Sayers, who ran a small claim 2 miles east of the Dunbar Road, said, "What is heating the room?" Caleb said, "The wall." Sayers looked at the stones. He looked at the channel. He crouched down and held his palm above the surface the way Ruth had done 4 hours earlier. He said, "I've got a cabin with 4 children in it." Caleb said, "Come find me when the storm breaks. I'll come look at your north wall." Sayers nodded and stood, and did not say anything else. Dawn came without announcement, just a slow change in the quality of the dark at the window, gray replacing black by degrees, until the room held enough light to see without the lamp. Ruth put her hand on Clara's forehead. She held it there. Then she lifted it and set it in her lap and looked at the wall across the room. The fever had broken. Caleb took the promissory note from the table and held it for a moment. Then he set it down. It had been paid since November. There was nothing left to do with it. Ruth picked it up without looking at him and folded it once and set it in the iron box and closed the lid. Not hidden, just put away. Greer and the two men rose when the light was full enough to travel by. Greer put on his coat. He buttoned it. He picked up his hat from the table where he had set it and turned it once in his hands. At the door he stopped. He looked back at the north wall. He did not look at Caleb. Then he went out. Caleb stood at the open door and watched the three of them move east across the white plains until the distance took them. The blizzard had spent itself in the night. The sky was the color of tin, flat and still, and the snow lay unbroken in every direction as far as the light reached. Nothing moved out there. Nothing at all. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. A man who builds in silence still builds. What he raises in the dark is what holds when the storm arrives. If this story moved, you subscribe and ride with us into the next. There is another story waiting. Another person who built what others said could not stand, who held on when the cold came, who did not ask permission to survive. We will tell that one together.